Elias Thorne had mistaken the silence for peace. For 7 years, since the river swelled and stole the world from him, the quiet had been his only companion, a thick, woolen blanket he wrapped around himself in the high mountain cabin he'd built with hands that once held his wife's. The cabin stood as a monument to a ghost, its hearth cold more often than not, its second bedroom a shrine of untouched linens and dust motes dancing in the lonely afternoon light. He was a man carved from grief, his features sharpened by solitude and his voice a rusted hinge from disuse. He chopped wood not for warmth but for exhaustion, hoping to tire his body so his mind couldn't wander back to the sound of Anya's laughter or the phantom weight of their unborn child. His existence was a steady, rhythmic march towards nothing, and he believed this was all that remained for him. That was until the sound of a splintering branch, too deliberate for a deer, cracked the stillness of a late autumn evening. He looked up from the leather strap he was mending, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, narrowing towards the window. Outside, the sky was bruising purple, the wind beginning to keen through the pines, promising a vicious storm. And then he saw them. 3 figures, stumbling through the trees at the edge of his clearing, their movements frantic, desperate. He rose, his hand instinctively going to the heavy axe handle leaning against the doorframe. They were women, their clothes torn and smeared with mud, their faces pale with terror. 2 of them supported the third, who seemed on the verge of collapse. As they drew closer, breaking into the open space he considered his last bastion against the world, he saw the impossible truth of their condition. All 3 of them were heavily pregnant, their forms stark and vulnerable against the encroaching wilderness. One of them, the clear leader with fierce, determined eyes, saw him in the doorway and her expression crumbled from desperation into a plea. She and the second sister lowered the third to her knees in the dirt, the woman letting out a soft, defeated cry. The leader, her own breath coming in ragged sobs, took a step forward, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Please," she gasped, the word snatched away by the wind. "Please, sir. Help us." There's nowhere else. Elias's heart, a stone in his chest for so long, gave a painful, unfamiliar lurch. Every instinct, honed by years of self-imposed exile, screamed at him to bar the door, to preserve the sterile safety of his sorrow. Helping them meant inviting their trouble into his home, a home that had not known the presence of another soul since Anya. It meant shattering the silence he had so carefully curated. He looked at their exhausted, terrified faces, at the swell of their bellies which promised a life he himself had been denied, and he saw a reflection of a different kind of storm, one that had raged inside him for years. The woman on her knees looked up, her eyes glassy with tears, and in that moment, she was not a stranger, she was every vulnerability he had failed to protect, every hope he had lost. The wind howled, ripping at their thin clothing, and the first fat drops of icy rain began to fall. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a command from a part of himself he thought long dead. With a groan that was more than just the sound of rusted vocal cords, Elias stepped aside, holding the heavy wooden door open. "Get inside," he rasped, his voice a gravelly shock in the rising tempest. "All of you." Now the women stared for a half-second, disbelief warring with relief on their faces, before scrambling to obey. They helped their faltering sister to her feet and shuffled past him into the dim warmth of the cabin, bringing with them the scent of wet earth, pine, and pure, unadulterated fear. As the last one crossed the threshold, Elias shut the door, the heavy thud of the bolt sliding home sounding less like an act of closure and more like the first note of a song he never thought he would hear again. The storm broke then, unleashing its fury upon the mountainside, but for the first time in 7 years, the real storm was inside the cabin walls. The first hour was a silent flurry of motion, a pantomime of need and reluctant provision. The 3 sisters huddled together near the hearth, their shivering slowly subsiding as Elias coaxed a fire back to life. The flames crackled, casting dancing shadows that made the small cabin feel both smaller and infinitely more crowded. He moved with an economy of motion that belied his long dormancy, fetching dry blankets, ones that hadn't been touched since Anya, and ladling hot broth from a pot that was usually meant to last him 3 days. He placed the steaming bowls on the rough-hewn table without a word, his gaze averted, as if looking at them too directly might break the fragile truce he'd made with his own heart. The sisters, in turn, were as quiet as frightened mice. They murmured their thanks, their voices soft and hoarse. the one who had been on her knees, the youngest by the look of her, had fallen into an exhausted sleep, curled beneath a blanket on the floor. The other two ate with a desperate hunger that spoke of days on the run. The leader, whose name he would learn was Ilara, watched him with intelligent, wary eyes. The other, Lyra, jumped at every creak of the cabin and every roar of the wind outside. Elias could feel their story pressing in on him, an unspoken weight in the air, but he did not ask. Asking was an invitation, and he was not yet ready to be a host to anything more than their physical presence. He retreated to his corner, ostensibly to clean his rifle, but really to observe. He saw how Ilara would periodically place a calming hand on Lyra's arm, how she would check on their sleeping sister, Cassia, with a maternal tenderness that was both beautiful and painful to witness. He noticed something else, too. Around each of their necks, resting against their collarbones, was a delicate silver locket, identical in design, a stylized bird with its wings unfurled. It was an odd detail, a touch of elegance at odds with their ragged state. As the storm raged on, a strange and unwelcome warmth began to seep into the frozen core of Elias's being. The simple sounds, the soft clinking of spoons against ceramic bowls, the gentle rustle of the blankets, the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping girl, were weaving a tapestry of life within his tomb of a home. He found himself remembering Anya, not with the usual sharp stab of grief, but with a dull, aching fondness. She would have known what to do. She would have bustled around them, offering comfort and chamomile tea, her voice a soothing melody against the storm's percussion. He was a poor substitute, a creature of silence and stone offering only a roof and a fire. After they had eaten, Ilara finally spoke, her voice stronger now. "We won't be a burden for long," she said, her gaze steady. "Just until the storm passes." "We are grateful, more than you know." Elias merely grunted in response, his knuckles white where he gripped the rifle stock. But the world outside had other plans. Just as a lull fell in the wind's assault, he heard it, a faint sound, almost lost in the gale. A horse's whinny. He froze, his head snapping up. He moved to the window, peering through a small section he'd wiped clear of condensation. Far below, at the base of the trail leading to his cabin, a lone rider was visible, a dark silhouette against the stormy grey landscape. The rider held a lantern, its light swinging back and forth, methodically scanning the mountainside. A scout! Their trouble had a face, and it was looking for them. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, cut through the budding warmth in his chest. He turned from the window, his expression grim. "He's found us," Lyra whispered, her face ashen, having seen the look on his face. Ilara's hand flew to the locket at her throat. "Silas," she breathed, the name a curse. The name hung in the air, an invisible poison. Silas. Elias felt a jolt, a phantom memory of ash and screaming, of cold river water and a name shouted in fury and blame years ago. He had heard that name before, in a different context, tied to a different tragedy. His tragedy. His carefully constructed wall of silence and solitude was not just cracked, it was about to be obliterated. The scout below turned his horse and rode back the way he came, but Elias knew it was not a retreat. It was a report. They were no longer just sheltering from a storm, they were caught in the eye of a hurricane, and it was heading directly for them. The revelation that their pursuer was a man named Silas acted like a key, unlocking a vault of buried history in Elias's mind. For 7 years, that name had been a whisper in the darkest corners of his memory, the architect of his ruin. Silas. A name synonymous with greed, a man who built his empire on cut corners and broken lives. Elias knew him not as a pursuer of women, but as the owner of the mining company whose poorly constructed dam had burst, releasing a torrent of water that had scoured the valley below, taking with it a dozen homes, a score of lives, and his Anya. He remembered the official inquiries, the way Silas, with his expensive lawyers and political connections, had sidestepped all responsibility, painting the catastrophe as an act of God, an unforeseeable tragedy. Elias had seen him once, on the steps of the courthouse, a man in a fine suit with eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky, offering hollow condolences while his empire remained untouched. Now, that same man's shadow fell upon his door. The conflict was no longer abstract, it was a ghost from his past, returned to haunt him in the flesh. This realization hardened something within him, transforming his reluctance into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He was no longer just a man offering shelter, he was a gatekeeper standing before the abyss. He turned from the window, his gaze falling upon the sisters, and saw them not as burdens, but as fellow survivors of the same man's wreckage. He finally met Ilara's eyes directly. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice low but firm, devoid of its earlier rust. Hesitantly at first, then with a torrent of pent-up fear and indignation, Ilara told their story. Their parents had been tenant farmers on land owned by Silas, and upon their sudden deaths from a fever, Silas had taken the sisters under his guardianship. It was a gilded cage. He controlled every aspect of their lives. A man obsessed with his legacy but cursed with 3 sterile sons, Silas had devised a monstrous plan. He intended for the sisters to be surrogate mothers, to bear his grandchildren and secure his bloodline. They were treated as prized livestock, their worth measured only by the life they could carry. The silver lockets, she explained with a bitter twist of her lips, were not gifts but brands, marking them as his property. They had endured it, clinging to each other, until they realized he had no intention of ever letting them or their children go. They would be prisoners forever. And so, they had planned their escape, a desperate flight into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the fierce, protective love for the unborn children they were determined to raise in freedom. As she spoke, Lyra wept silently, and even Cassia, awake now, listened with a haunted look in her young eyes. Elias listened to every word, each detail a hammer blow against the edifice of his grief. The man who had taken his future was now trying to steal theirs. The symmetry of the cruelty was staggering. It was as if fate had conspired to bring this confrontation to his doorstep, offering him a choice he never knew he wanted, to remain a victim of his past, or to become the instrument of its reckoning. The storm outside seemed to pale in comparison to the one building within the cabin's walls. The firelight flickered across their faces, illuminating a shared enemy, a shared cause. What would you do in this situation? Would you send them away, hoping the monster would pass you by, or would you make their fight your own, knowing it could cost you everything you have left? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. For Elias, the question was no longer a dilemma. It was a clarification of purpose. He looked at the axe by the door, at the rifle in his hands, at the rugged, unforgiving terrain outside that he knew better than any man alive. This mountain, his refuge of sorrow, was about to become a fortress. He would not run. He would not hide them and pray for the best. He would make his stand here. He owed it to Anya. He owed it to the children they never had. And he owed it to these 3 brave women who had stumbled into his life and reminded him that some things were still worth fighting for. He will come here, Elias stated, his voice ringing with an authority that surprised even himself. And when he does, we will be ready. The dawn broke grey and cold, the fury of the storm replaced by an eerie, watchful calm. The air was thick with tension, every snap of a twig in the woods outside sounding like a footstep. Elias moved with a quiet, lethal grace, transforming the cabin from a home into a stronghold. He barred the back window, reinforced the door, and laid out his meager arsenal, the heavy woodsman's axe, his hunting rifle, and a long, sharp knife he usually reserved for skinning game. He was no soldier, but he was a creature of this mountain, and he would use its every advantage. The sisters watched him, their fear palpable but now mingled with a sliver of hope. He had given them a purpose beyond just running. He gave them tasks, keeping their hands and minds busy. Cassia was put on watch at the front window, her young eyes sharp. Lyra, her hands trembling but steady, was instructed to boil water and tear strips from old linen sheets for bandages. Ilara, her natural leadership shining through, helped Elias move a heavy wardrobe to partially block the main entrance, creating a bottleneck. There was little talk, only the shared language of preparation. In their silent work, a fragile bond was forged, a fellowship of the hunted. Elias found himself speaking more than he had in years, his words clipped and practical, but they were a bridge being built across the chasm of his isolation. Mid-morning, Cassia's sharp intake of breath was the signal. "They're here," she whispered. Elias moved to her side, peering out. 4 men on horseback were picking their way up the trail. 3 were rough-looking hands, but the man in the lead sat tall and imperious in his saddle, his tailored coat a stark black against the muted greens and browns of the forest. Silas. Even from a distance, Elias recognized the posture of arrogance, the cold certainty of a man who believed the world belonged to him. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, 100 yards from the cabin. Silas dismounted, his movements unhurried, as if he were arriving for a business appointment. He strode forward alone, stopping 20 yards from the door. "Elias Thorne," he called out, his voice smooth and cultured, yet carrying an unmistakable menace. "I know you are in there. I confess, I am surprised. I thought the tragedy in the valley had broken you completely." It seems I was mistaken. Elias's hand tightened on his rifle. The man's audacity was breathtaking. He dared to speak of the tragedy he had caused as if it were a passing observation. He motioned for the sisters to stay back, away from the door, before unlatching it and stepping out onto the small porch. He stood there, his feet planted, the rifle held loosely at his side. He was a stark contrast to Silas, a rugged, weathered man of the mountain against the polished, corrupt man of the valley. "Silas," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "You are not welcome here. Turn around and leave my land." Silas laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Your land? A quaint notion. Everything this water touches is my land, Thorne. And you are harboring my property." He gestured dismissively towards the cabin. "Send out the girls. They carry my legacy. This has nothing to do with you. It is a simple matter of retrieval. Don't be a fool and die for someone else's mistake." The psychological attack was clear. Frame Elias as a meddling outsider, a fool caught up in affairs that were not his own. But Silas had miscalculated. He did not know the depth of the wound he had inflicted 7 years prior. "The only mistake I see here is you," Elias replied, his voice dangerously calm. "You took my family. You think I will let you take another?" A flicker of confusion, then dawning recognition, crossed Silas's face. "The dam," he said, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his lips. "Ah, yes. Your wife. I remember. A pity. But business has its risks. Progress has its price." The casual dismissal of Anya's life, of their child's life, was the final spark. The cold resolve in Elias's chest ignited into a righteous fire. "This is not business," Elias said, raising the rifle so it was pointing squarely at Silas's chest. "This is a reckoning." Silas's smile vanished, replaced by a snarl of rage. "You've made your choice, old man." He turned and gave a sharp signal to his men. But as they spurred their horses forward, Elias was already in motion. He had anticipated this. He fired not at Silas, but at a precariously balanced dead pine he had identified earlier, perched on the rocky outcrop above the trail. The crack of the rifle echoed through the valley, and with a great groan, the massive tree shuddered and crashed down, blocking the path and sending the horses into a panicked frenzy. 2 of the men were thrown, the third struggling to control his terrified mount. Silas was cut off. He stared, momentarily stunned, before drawing a pistol from his coat. But Elias was gone, having slipped back inside the cabin, the heavy door slamming shut. The siege had begun, but the hunter had become the hunted, isolated and exposed in a land that answered to another master. The world outside the cabin descended into a tense, deadly waiting game. Silas, enraged and stranded, roared orders at his disoriented men, his polished veneer stripped away to reveal the feral tyrant beneath. From the window, Elias watched them regroup, their initial shock giving way to cautious aggression. They took cover behind the fallen tree and the surrounding boulders, their rifles glinting in the pale light. The first gunshot shattered the quiet, splintering the wood of the doorframe inches from Elias's head. The sisters gasped, huddled together behind the hearth, their faces masks of terror. But Elias was calm, a man possessed of a singular, chilling purpose. This was his ground. He knew its every dip and rise, every shadow and sight line. He had spent 7 years learning its secrets, and now he would use them as weapons. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low anchor in their sea of fear. He moved from window to window, a ghost in his own home, never presenting a stable target. He didn't return fire wantonly, every shot had to count. His second shot was not aimed at a man, but at a loose rock high on the cliff face above Silas's position. The bullet sparked against the stone, dislodging a shower of smaller rocks and scree, forcing Silas and one of his men to scramble for new cover, exposing their position. Inside, a new dynamic was taking shape. Elara, seeing Elias's calculated defense, refused to remain a helpless victim. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice tight with resolve. Lyra and Cassia looked at her, then at Elias, their fear now warring with a desperate desire to contribute. Elias glanced at them, a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, in his eyes. "The back window," he said. "Break the glass quietly. When I give the signal, make as much noise as you can from there." Draw their attention as Silas's men focused their fire on the front of the cabin. Elara and Lyra worked at the rear window, using the handle of a heavy iron skillet to carefully break and remove the panes of glass. The fight became a battle of wits. Silas, accustomed to winning through intimidation and overwhelming force, grew increasingly frustrated by the invisible, methodical defense. He pushed his men to be more aggressive, to rush the cabin. But Elias was always a step ahead, using the terrain's natural funnels and blind spots to his advantage. A shot from his rifle ricocheted off a rock, making one of the henchmen cry out and retreat. He was a phantom, his presence felt everywhere and nowhere at once. The turning point came when Silas, in a fit of arrogant fury, decided to lead a charge himself. "He's coming!" Cassia cried from her post. Elias saw him, running in a low crouch, using the cover of a large boulder to approach the porch. "Now!" Elias yelled to the sisters. From the back of the cabin, they began to scream and bang the skillet against the log walls, creating a convincing cacophony. The two remaining henchmen, startled, turned their fire towards the new sound, believing it to be another defender. The diversion gave Elias the 2 seconds he needed. As Silas burst from behind the rock, raising his pistol to fire at the front door, Elias was not there. He was at the side window, his aim steady. He fired. The shot did not kill Silas. It was aimed not at his heart, but at his hand. The pistol flew from his grasp with a metallic clatter, his hand erupting in a spray of blood. Silas howled, a sound of pure shock and agony, clutching his shattered hand. His men, seeing their invincible leader fall, hesitated. Their loyalty, bought with money and maintained by fear, began to waver. That hesitation was all Elias needed. He stepped out onto the porch, his rifle leveled, his face a mask of cold fury. "It's over, Silas," he said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "Your legacy dies here today." On this mountain, Silas stared up at him, his face contorted with pain and hatred, but also with the dawning, humiliating realization of his defeat. He had been beaten not by an army, but by one grieving man and 3 pregnant women, beaten by a ghost he had created 7 years ago. The henchmen, seeing the tables had turned so completely, slowly lowered their rifles and began to back away, abandoning their master to his fate on the cold, unforgiving ground. The battle was over. The aftermath was not loud or triumphant, but quiet and profound. With Silas's men having fled and Silas himself bound and grimacing in pain, the tension that had held the cabin in a vice grip for 2 days finally broke. Elias sent one of the now compliant henchmen, who had surrendered meekly, down the mountain with a simple message for the nearest town's sheriff. There was a criminal named Silas awaiting justice on his land, a man wanted for far more than just the day's transgressions. The arrival of the law was a quiet affair. The sheriff, a man who remembered the dam disaster all too well, listened intently to Elias's calm account and the sisters' trembling but resolute testimony. Silas was led away, a broken man stripped of his power, his threats and curses fading into the vastness of the wilderness. In the days that followed, the cabin began to transform. The scars of the firefight, the splintered wood, the broken glass, were mended. But more importantly, the scars within its sole occupant began to heal. The silence that returned was different now. It was not the oppressive quiet of grief, but the peaceful silence of sanctuary. It was punctuated by the soft murmur of the sisters' voices, the gentle hum of Elara sewing clothes from old blankets, the scent of Cassia baking bread in the hearth. The second bedroom, once a shrine to a ghost, was cleaned and prepared, no longer for a memory, but for the future. As autumn bled into winter, the mountain became their world. Elias, the recluse, became Elias, the teacher. He taught them the ways of the wilderness, how to read the snow for animal tracks, which roots were safe to eat, how to fish through a hole in the frozen creek. They, in turn, taught him how to live again. They filled his silent home with stories and tentative laughter, coaxing his rusted voice into conversation and, eventually, a rare, gentle smile. When the first snows fell thick and deep, trapping them in their high-altitude haven, the first of the babies was born. Lyra, the most fearful of the sisters, delivered a healthy baby boy with Elara and Elias acting as midwives. Holding the small, squirming life in his calloused hands, Elias felt a crack in the final wall around his heart. A wave of emotion so powerful it stole his breath washed over him, not the grief he knew so well, but a fierce, protective love. 2 more births followed in the heart of winter, 2 beautiful baby girls. The cabin, once a monument to loss, became a cradle of life. The sounds of crying infants, of soft lullabies sung by their mothers, filled every corner, chasing away the last of the shadows. Elias Thorne, the widower who lived alone for years, was alone no longer. He was a guardian, a provider, a grandfather in all but blood. He had not replaced the family he'd lost, but had allowed his heart to grow large enough to build a new one. The seasons turned. Spring arrived, melting the snow and bringing a carpet of wildflowers to the clearing. The babies grew, their gurgles turning into laughter. Elias would often sit on the porch, one of the infants cradled in his arms, and watch the sisters working in the small garden they had planted. He had confronted the man who destroyed his past, and in doing so, had discovered an unexpected future. His redemption had not come from vengeance, but from protection. His healing had not come from forgetting, but from loving again. He had found his peace not in the silence, but in the beautiful, chaotic, and vibrant symphony of a family he never expected to have. What does it truly mean to be strong? Is it the ability to withstand pain in solitude, to build walls so high that nothing can ever hurt you again? Or is it the courage to tear those walls down, to open your door to the vulnerable, and to fight for something more than just your own survival? The story of Elias and the 3 sisters reminds us that our deepest wounds can sometimes become the source of our greatest strength. His grief didn't just break him, it carved out a space in his heart for a profound empathy he didn't know he possessed. What would you have done if you were in Elias's shoes? Would you have seen the sisters as a threat, or as a chance for redemption? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We believe that everyone has a story of a time they chose compassion over comfort, or a time when the kindness of a stranger changed everything. Please, share your experience with our community. Your story could be the light that helped someone else find their way through the darkness. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel and clicking the notification bell. You'll be the first to see our new videos, where we explore the incredible power of the human spirit to overcome, to heal, and to find hope in the most unexpected places. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes, the family we find is the family that saves us.